The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately, her flow of blood dried up. She felt it in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid. Just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that, they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Good morning. So, my kids hate it when I talk about the good old days. They really hate it when I start a sentence with, "Back in my day." But back in my day, things were different. Can you hear me okay with we got new speakers. Is it loud enough? Okay. So back in my day, things moved a lot slower. Life was just slower. We had to be more patient with things. So as an example, if you can remember, if you were alive in 1984, I was. And I lived in a small town, so we'd go to the store a lot, and you wouldn't find the exact thing you needed. So what you did was you drove down we had a little Sears in this little town, and you got out the catalog, and you found what you wanted, and you were so happy, and you ordered it, and they said, "It'll be here in 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8. That was life in those days. And as a kid, it got even worse, because we didn't have cable TV where I lived, so we got maybe 3 stations on a good day. So if I wanted to watch cartoons, better get up early on Saturday morning and beat the rest of the family to the television, because we only had one. Can you imagine? One TV? A little one? We did have color, but that's the only time you could watch cartoons. You had to wait a whole week before you could watch cartoons. And if we wanted to keep in touch with anybody who lived out of town, you could kind of forget about that, right? If you remember, you had this thing called a phone, a telephone on the wall. Right? You had to dial. Kids are like, "What is he talking about?" Yeah, this thing. You couldn't make a phone call unless you're right by this phone. You're about 6 feet. And if you called somebody out of town, you were going to go broke. So we had family in China, or Taiwan rather, and we really went broke. But we learned how to use letters instead, right? Write letters. Anybody write letters anymore? Yeah, you put it in the mailbox, put a stamp on it. Anyway, it would take at least what? If you sent a letter, it'd take a week to get there. The person would have to respond. If they responded quickly, it'd take another week to get back to you. So we'd have a conversation that lagged 2 weeks, right? So you better get all your questions asked because you're going to take 2 weeks before you get this conversation going. So it was kind of different, wildly different, because today we have what? Instant communication, same-day deliveries, on-demand television, anywhere you go, as long as you got the phone, which I'll remind you to turn off or turn down right now. Hey, clever, right? But we have this constant contact. We have on-demand living. We don't really have to wait for anything for the most part. Day-to-day patience is not something we're really forced to exercise or develop as much as we had to back in my day. All the technological progress and innovation we've made has enabled us to kind of live as very impatient people, which I guess is okay as long as our technology and innovations can keep up with our on-demand lifestyle. But we all know there are times when our need-it-now desires can't be satisfied. Often those are moments of crisis involving our health or the health of people we love. Times when we or someone else has been injured or gets sick. In those moments, healing just can't seem to come fast enough as we find ourselves waiting for appointments, treatments, and therapies. And improvements in our health can seem to just come so slowly, like the slow drip moving at a snail's pace before we see any improvement. Serious health problems require a level of patience that the rest of our need-it-now, get-it-now lives really haven't prepared us to have. And so what happens is we can get really aggravated really quickly. We get frustrated about how long this healing is taking. We get mad that our suffering has gone on forever. And sometimes, if we're not careful, that anger can turn toward God, and we can lose our faith. We can come to a place where we believe that God can't help us or God doesn't care. And that is a place of anguish and hopelessness that's simply unbearable. But today's gospel gives us a reason to hope, to hold on to our faith with patience. The stories we heard remind us that God does care and help is on the way, even though it might be hard to believe or see. The stories remind us that God's calendar is different than our calendar. And maybe that's the way it is when you are eternal and literally have all the time in the universe to get anything done. You don't have to get in a hurry. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't care. And that doesn't mean that God isn't working right now to make things better for us. Maybe God just sees a bigger picture and has a different sense of time. So I want to give you something to think about in terms of time and the pace at which God works. If you like trivia or numbers, you'll love this. If you don't, I apologize. So, life expectancy in the Roman Empire when Jesus was walking around. So what's that, 30 AD. Life expectancy was, anybody have a guess? How long could you expect to live if you were Jesus' neighbor? Loud. 35. Oh gosh, you guys are ruining this for me. Yeah, 30. 25 to 30, best that people can tell. If you made it to 30, that was pretty much in the average. So Jesus dying at age around 33, we think, had a pretty average lifespan for his time. By the time 1980 rolled around, when I had my one television, life expectancy for us in the United States had climbed up to 74 years, 2.5 to 3 times more than the ancient Israelite. And the improvements didn't stop there. From 1980 to 2020, life expectancy in the United States grew from 74 years to 79 years. We're living today nearly 5 years longer than we might have just 40 years ago. Now, if 5 doesn't seem impressive to you, imagine if I told you, hey, you're going to live 5 years less than you thought. You'd think that was a pretty big number, especially if you have gray hair like me. 79 sounds a lot better than 69. Now, for more good news, we can look at progress we've made against cancer. Over the past 4 decades, just the past 40 years, the 5-year survival rate for breast cancer used to be about 75% back in 1980. Now that number is up to 90%. During that same time, the 5-year survival rate for prostate cancer has jumped from 67% to an incredible 98%. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's remarkable. Almost miraculous, we would say. And we could all argue that, well, this is just our doing, right? Humans figuring it out, using science to extend our lives. And I'd say, fair enough, I don't disagree with you. We had a lot to do with this. We are using science, our ability to understand, learn, test things about the world and ourselves to improve and extend our lives. But I would ask you, where does the science come from? Where does our intelligence come from? It's a gift from God, just as knowing that God exists and simply having the ability to have faith is a gift from God. All that said, God's slow pace can be frustrating, and God's ways can be very confusing. We can have moments of doubt and wonder if God cares, and that's okay. Even Jesus himself cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Similarly, we can lose our patience with God. But thankfully, God does not lose his patience with us. God is merciful. God is faithful. And we see that clearly in today's gospel with this story, right? Jairus, a man of faith, was scared for his sick daughter's life. He had just traveled to ask Jesus to heal her, and together they were heading back to his house to save her life. Then all of a sudden, they're going down the street, going down the road, and Jairus' neighbors come running out to him and saying, "Your daughter has died." But Jesus, knowing what he could do, didn't panic. He comforted Jairus with these words. And I think these are words that we need to kind of hold on to because they're important to us as they were to Jairus. Jesus said what? "Do not be afraid. Just have faith." We also heard about the woman who suffered from an incurable disease for 12 years and spent all her money, seen all the doctors, and nothing was getting better. Sound familiar? During those 12 years, she could have easily lost her faith. Who would have blamed her? But the woman never lost hope. She catches up to God in the person of Jesus, grabs his cloak, and receives a miracle after 12 long years of suffering. And Jesus says the words to her that we all long to hear. "Your faith has saved you." In today's world, it's hard to imagine waiting for more than 30 minutes to get anything we want before we lose our patience. But keeping our patience with God is something worth doing, and it's something we can do. We just need to remember that God doesn't work on our schedule. God works in God's time. And we have to make ourselves okay with that. We have to be okay with waiting patiently, like Jairus and the hemorrhaging woman. And we have to remember the stories, not only in the Bible, but the stories of our own lives, of my life, of your life, of all those you've met. These stories, they tell us time and time again the same thing, that God is trustworthy. We can trust that God will send us what we need when we need it. But Jesus said it best. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Just have faith.